Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode here on the Historian Lounge. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, also known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. Joining me today is another guest from my Wandering Scribe podcast. My guest today is a former intelligence analyst with a highly prolific profile as a writer and military historian. He is highly experienced with particulars in feature writing, report writing, and communicating with specialists and non-specialists alike. He specializes in a wide range of defense issues that include counter-terrorism, militant Islam, and regional conflicts. He has been published in a broad spectrum of publications for well over 30 years. His expertise has been called upon by various multimedia news outlets, publishers, and TV production companies, as well as the Military Court Service. He has also established authors numerous books to his name. Joining us today for the very first time on the YouTube channel is my good friend, military historian, author, as well as all-around great person, Anthony Tucker Jones.
Hi, Gabriel.
Anthony,
thank you very much for having me on. And also, thank you for that very fulsome introduction. It rather sounded like I was applying for a job, didn't it? So I did hear that kind of biography. You go, is that me? Have I done all that?
Yes, you have, Anthony. And for those who have followed Anthony on LinkedIn, you know that Anthony writes a wide range of books, but probably his most famous ones, or ones that people know him the most, are his World War II books. Either that is on military battles, generals, commanders, leaders, and so forth. And that will be the topic of this discussion, which will be military strategies of the Second World War. So, as like a starting point, Anthony, in your research of different generals, different battles, what have you noticed has been like the comparison with military strategies of the Second World War as opposed to as its predecessor, the First World War or the Great War? How the strategies have changed in that 40-year period?
I mean, of course, the overall strategy was one of waging global warfare. And obviously that's where, they're both world wars. And indeed, famously, the 7 Years' War during the 1700s was also pretty global in nature. I think probably the thing that causes changes with all warfare, it enhances strategy, if you like, is developing technologies. So a lot of the technologies that emerged during the First World War had reached maturity by the second. Although a lot of them, military theorists are still trying to fathom out how to work properly, or what was the best way to get the most out of them. Key example of that, of course, is tanks, bombers. By the beginning of the Second World War, they were still largely viewed as infantry support weapons, so were not seen as decisive weapons in their own right, which of course is
right.
With Blitzkrieg they became, and the strategic bomber campaign they became. So the other thing is, I think that changing technologies also in terms of strategy, particularly when it came to the German strategy, the opening part of the Second World War, is it speeded things up because it made what modern day military commanders would call maneuver warfare much more rapid. And again, that was another thing that emerged from the opening stages of the Second World War, was whereas of course we'd seen this sort of terrible stalemate, particularly on the Western Front during the First World War.
Right.
Actually, the Western campaign in 1940 was very fluid, very quick. And in fact, the French were knocked out of the war very, very rapidly. And that was simply because, of course, that traditional idea of there being static defense lines had largely vanished overnight thanks to the German Blitzkrieg. Because, as we all know, the French had tried to defend their borders with a fixed defence line, the Maginot Line, and indeed the Germans had done the same thing on their side with the Siegfried Line. But of course, famously, the Germans just went around it with their tanks and motorised infantry, so they made it redundant overnight. The French had spent millions of francs building these concrete forts, and they were rendered useless. So I think probably the key thing in terms of strategy was options were made. Options for military commanders had improved by the Second World War. Another example of that is what we would term as combined operations and amphibious warfare. That was very, very much in its infancy during the First World War, and again was in its infancy at the beginning of the Second World War. But very rapidly it evolved into what you and I would know now as amphibious warfare. Landing craft, fighter bombers, warships providing fire support. Special operations on the flanks, all that sort of thing, airborne ops to support the landings, all those sorts of things. They kind of came to maturity during the Second World War, and it wasn't famously, of course, the sort of clearing of the Mediterranean in 42 and 43, particularly when it got to Operation Husky, was a bit of a test ground because a lot of the technologies had not matured or available. So things like US Liberty ships for transporting supplies. Landing craft, which you and I would take for granted today, of course, they were just in their infancy. It was all that sort of, it's bringing technology to improve your strategic options, if you like.
Definitely, and it is true. World War I was pretty much like the staging ground for like all these new things, and the Second World War was, of course, the implications. And I also think it's another thing to note is World War II. It's also the birth of what we would now use the modern term as special forces. You had the sort of like elite units that came about, especially during like Operation Market Garden, especially the beginning of like the SAS, and then of course you had the OSS, which came about later, which also came with like military intelligence. That was also a huge military strategy because that really wasn't a thing, or at least conceptually at the time of World War I. So when we see into now that aspect, how would you say military intelligence played into World War II, and where do we kind of see the birthplace of military intelligence? Like, what country was like the first to like truly say, we really need to update this side because there's been a lot of issues with communications in the First World War. We don't need to have that happen for any wars in the future.
You raise a good point there, because I think a key lesson, obviously, that came from the First World War is nobody wanted to expend troops at the rate they had during the First World War. Famously on the Somme, 60,000 British casualties in a single day. So no commander in his right mind wanted to repeat those mistakes. And to avoid making them, of course, you need really good intelligence. I mean, that's one of the great things about something like Operation Overlord and the D-Day landings, is the intelligence was very good. And also, of course, by the opening stage of the Second World War, signals intelligence was becoming more and more sophisticated. So here in the UK, of course, famously, you've got Bletchley Park with the code and cipher tool. So we were eavesdropping increasingly on first German and then indeed Japanese communications, which gave us a better level of intelligence. The irony is that with something like Bletchley Park, of course, you have to, when you have an intelligence source, the primary responsibility is to protect that. You must never reveal where you've got that information from, because obviously if it finds out, that avenue will close up, and also you may lose, particularly if it's agents, they'll get caught, or for instance something like Enigma, they will change the coding on the Enigma machine. So you have to keep a great length. So certainly with something like the Battle of Britain, Churchill was well informed, courtesy of Bletchley Park, about the Luftwaffe intentions, because they were intercepting Luftwaffe communications. So RAF Fighter Command had that advantage that it was getting, not directly, because again it was a closely guarded secret, but RAF Fighter Command was benefiting from that intelligence. And then something like Operation Barbarossa, we had very good intelligence that the Germans were going to attack Stalin, but Churchill had a problem in that, how did he tip Stalin off with not telling him that we were reading German communications? And of course, the way he got around it was he said, well, we actually have, it's come from spies through espionage. And Stalin had a very dim view of spies, so wasn't inclined to listen to Churchill. And also, Stalin thought Churchill was feeding this information because Churchill wanted Soviet Union to go to war with Germany to take the pressure off Britain, who of course was already at war
Right.
with Hitler. So your intelligence improves, it improves tenfold. But the problem is, how do you use it? How do you disseminate it? How do you safeguard it? Again, for us, for the famous bombing of the city of Coventry, it's always argued that Churchill rather callously sacrificed the city to a major Luftwaffe raid because he didn't want to divulge that Bletchley Park knew that attack was coming. Now, actually, when you look at the detail, we knew that something was coming, but there were a number of cities that were candidates. So actually, as with all these things, nothing is black and white. But of course, that sort of folklore history went down that Churchill deliberately sacrificed Coventry in order to safeguard, an intelligence source. But I think you're right. In terms of First and Second World War, strategically, what it did was it improved your options. And if people listened to it, it also gave you forewarning. And I always found it very interesting that someone like Churchill, when he was in his wilderness years during the 1930s, when he didn't have a political office, was fed information by the British intelligence services, because during his various governmental jobs, he'd helped set them up. So they fed him information. So when he kept banging on about Hitler being a threat and the rise of Nazi Germany was a threat, it was based actually on very good intelligence, because he was seeing the information on how much Germany was spending on rearmament, what it was building, what it was doing in defiance of the Versailles Treaty, building U-boats and bombers and tanks, and all the sort of stuff that it was not supposed to be doing. And of course, people were sort of vaguely aware that they were doing it, but didn't want to make a point of it, because of course, no one wanted to rush into another European conflict.
Right.
But it meant, although everyone went, oh, well, Churchill was just a warmonger and, he was out of office so he could say whatever he wanted. Actually, he had a direct source into the intelligence community who, because they knew that he was pro what they were saying, they fed in that intelligence.
It is really interesting when we see so many movies of the battles of World War II. But it's also really important to note, like as we've been talking about, the military intelligence. I mean, that was critical. They were huge, and it was also not just, of course, the spies for the UK and the US. You also had the French spies who worked with the British and the Americans to feed information. And actually going back into France again, as you mentioned before, how when Germany just went into France and conquering all of it, questions always stuck out in my mind. In your honest opinion, Anthony, why do you think the Germans didn't really go forward with their plan? Let's conquer all of France. What was the hindrance in that policy? Because I know that they took most of northern France, only southern Vichy France was left as free, but it was kind of some would argue a puppet state to Nazi Germany France. So why didn't they, in a military sense, go through it? Because their military attention was more towards the Soviets or the UK, or why do you think they didn't go through with their plan militarily wise?
Well, the simple reason, Gabriel, is they didn't need to. Once France had sued for peace and signed an armistice, that armistice imposed very severe limitations on what the French could have in the way of a military. And in fact, they were allowed an army of 100,000 purely for internal security and nothing else. All their aircraft were grounded, their tanks were confiscated. Their fleet was either, required to remain in Toulon or Mers el Kabir in Algeria. So the armistice effectively took France out of the equation, as you rightly point out, without the Germans having to finish the job. Now, of course, famously, they did so in late 1942 in response to the Allied Operation Torch and the Allied landings in French North African colonial territories with Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco. They did then because obviously they needed to secure their southern flank once the Allies were dominating the Med. But by conquering just northern France, it gave them what they needed in terms of facing us, because obviously they were in Norway and the Low Countries and northern France, so they had all the bases and the ports that they needed to, if they were going to launch an invasion of the British Isles. It enabled them to dominate, obviously, the English Channel and the Bay of Biscay. So they up until late 42, they didn't really need to tie down extra divisions by occupying southern France. And the dilemma that the French had strategically, of course, was they'd sued for peace, but their primary aim was to keep the French Empire intact.
Right.
The French military, quite rightly, their first loyalty is to the government of the day, which in that case was Vichy France. But that posed a problem for Churchill because, of course, in an ideal world, all the French colonial possessions would have declared for the Free French and would have sided with us, but they didn't. So, of course, famously, it ended up with the Royal Navy attacking Mers el Kabir and sinking, shelling and sinking some of the French fleet. And then also required military operations in Lebanon and Syria and Madagascar to stop them becoming, assets for the enemy. So the French sort of ended up, because the problem, someone like Charles de Gaulle, who was the leader of the Free French, most Frenchmen never heard of him in 1940. He'd been a junior minister in the French government. He'd been a French armored division commander, and that was it. So he wasn't anyone famous. So most French military commanders would not. And French troops were evacuated off the beaches, but they then went straight home again. Rather than stay in Britain to form the basis for a free French army, they all went home to carry on the fight. But of course, very rapidly ended up either fleeing to the French colonies or being interned in France.
Right. It is really interesting. I'm actually glad you clarify that, because I've always wondered about why the Germans didn't occupy all of France. They could have done it. They were militarily stronger than the French. But thank you for clarifying that. So thank you. And another question, which I always find interesting when we discuss World War II, because World War II is like the melting pot of the what ifs when it comes to history. There's a lot of potential what ifs. And another what if that I think is very fascinating is, of course, Operation Barbarossa, which is where the Germans were invading the Soviet Union. And I've always thought, what would have happened if the Soviet Nazi Pact did not fall apart and they were actually still allies, or B, if Operation Barbarossa was a success. So in your research and researching that part of the war, did you come across with situations in the military strategies of both sides that it could have gone either way?
Picking up your first point, of course, alternative history is very popular. In fact, I have been invited in the past to write it, but it's never my kind of thing. But you have books on what would have happened if Operation Sea Lion had taken place, what would happen if the Germans won the Battle of Britain. So it's actually a very popular sort of subgenre in military history. In terms of the Eastern Front, you're right. If the Soviet Nazi Pact had remained and Hitler had not invaded the Soviet Union, then Britain really would have been in trouble, because all Germany's military resources could have been directed at invading the British Isles, or just, besieging us, conducting a U-boat campaign, bomber campaign,
Right.
But Hitler's plan always really was the invasion of the Soviet Union, because he wanted living space, and of course, the Soviet Union was massive. And also, Hitler never saw any benefit to him for defeating Britain, because he knew if he invaded Britain, the only people that would benefit post December 1941, that would benefit from Britain no longer controlling the British Empire, would be the Japanese.
Right.
Hitler would get no benefit from that. Furthermore, British government would have fled to Canada.
Right.
And there would have been a government in exile, an army in exile, and if America had still come into the war at some point or another, D-Day would have taken place in the British Isles, not in northern France.
Mm-hmm.
But because Hitler always wanted to turn east, that sort of took the pressure off us. And as I mentioned earlier, of course, Stalin was always a bit, untrusting that Churchill was trying to warn him that Hitler was going to attack him, because he was like, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? Because You need our help because you're on your own. France has been knocked out. All the Low Countries have gone. He's invaded Scandinavia, so you're really out on a limb. But in terms of could Hitler have ever won with Barbarossa, my personal opinion is no. It simply was not achievable. Simply because the Soviet Union is so vast, so the Red Army could just keep retreating till it got to Vladivostok if it didn't surrender or come to terms. So the Germans tripled, I think, their landmass with the huge territory they conquered in the Soviet Union. But what would they have done had the Red Army retreated east of the Urals, licked its wounds, got its factories going, and rebuilt? Because they would have come back again, wouldn't they? They would have liberated Western Russia. The only real hope that Hitler had was, he always wanted a 6-week campaign because, of course, he'd looked at what had happened in the West, in the Balkans and with France, and of course he was intoxicated by, and in Scandinavia, he was intoxicated by the success of the Blitzkrieg. His generals basically went, if we knock out the Red Army in 6 weeks, get to Moscow, if we take the Russian capital, they will have to sue for peace. What else can they do? That's what the French did. Declared Paris an open city, or Rotterdam, or Oslo. Once we're there, you take their political nerve center and they're out of the equation. Right. So they hoped to do that, take Moscow quickly. And I think the other hope was that there would be a major collapse in the Soviet Union, because, of course, Stalin wasn't that popular with the Red Army because of all the purges he conducted. And I think Hitler hoped that if the Soviet Union was given a sufficient blow, Stalin would be ousted, and whoever took over would seek terms, and Germany might get Ukraine, Belarus, the Crimea, maybe the Caucasus. So there was a hope that they might shave off Western Russia, but I think even if they'd done that, at some point or other, the Red Army would have come back. They wouldn't have just they wouldn't have just said, okay, fine, we were defeated, you keep that. They, Russian national honor would have required them at some point or other to launch a military campaign to oust the Germans out of the occupied territories. So it was a foolish gamble on the part of Hitler. The other thing is, we know, and I'm sure you're aware, is the problem that Hitler had with the invasion of the Soviet Union. He never really knew what the goals were. Initially it was Moscow, and then he gave up. Then it was Leningrad, but he couldn't take that. Then it was Stalingrad, but he couldn't take that. Then it was Baku, but he couldn't take that. So he started dissipating his forces over this absolutely enormous front on, the Eastern Front. Dissipated his forces. Plus, of course, he had to rely on his Axis allies, whose armies were not of the same caliber as the Germans. The Hungarians, Romanians, even the Italians, Slovaks. He had this hodgepodge of allies on the Eastern Front who, when they were attacked by the Red Army, simply collapsed.
Yeah, and it was, from history, the Red Army retaliated. They fought through from Stalingrad all the way. They wanted a vengeance, and it was kind of like Stalingrad became the rallying cry for the Red Army, saying we need to take back. As you said, Russian honor demanded retribution, and they obliterated. I'm sure there's a lot of war documentaries, photos of the time of just destruction by the Red Army. And in terms of military strategies, it's at least from my own research, the Red Army had one clear objective: is get into Germany and just take out Hitler. Just get there, find him, kill him, and just get anything in your way. And before we turn into the Pacific Theater, I did want to ask this other question: is where would you feel in the time frame that the military strategy of the German army quickly changed? Or actually, let me rephrase it: did the military strategies of the German Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS differ in the sense of the ultimate goal? Because for those who don't know that term, the Wehrmacht, the German Wehrmacht is, at least how I remember it and understand it, is the German army. The German Waffen-SS is, of course, the SS branch. And we only kind of get confused or kind of combine those two together, that the Waffen-SS and the Wehrmacht are the same thing, but they are very much two different things. So militarily wise, did those two groups kind of come into conflict with each other regarding military strategies as opposed to the Nazi policy of the party?
Before I answer that, to go back to your earlier point about, you know, having a swift victory over the Soviet Union, the other thing is the Germans knew from the very start that they were up against it because of the size of the Soviet population.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't matter how many Red Army soldiers they killed or captured, Soviet Union had the ability to replace them at a rate that Germany could not match. And of course, once Germany was in a war of attrition, it then rapidly became a war it couldn't win. You know, even if those recruits came from the Far East and were Tajiks and Uzbeks, couldn't speak Russian, all that sort of thing, and were inexperienced, they still had this vast manpower reserve. And German intelligence knew that from the very start, that the Soviet Union had the ability to generate new armies, which is why it needed a, you know, a rapid victory at the beginning. It needed a swift blow to get the Soviet Union to sue for peace, because if it didn't, then it was in trouble. In terms of, yeah, you're right. Wehrmacht tends to be used as a generic term for the German army, but actually it means armed forces. So it covers the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. So the Wehrmacht, you're right, is the German armed forces. The Waffen-SS is a separate entity controlled by the SS, controlled by Heinrich Himmler, and in fact was, you know, a rival army, if you like. Never had the same manpower as the German army did, but it fought alongside the German army and was usually controlled by the German army. It wasn't until the end of the war that SS generals started controlling armies and corps level operations. And in terms of your question about strategy, once it became clear that Germany was not going to have a swift victory over the Soviet Union, and indeed that the Soviets began to regenerate their armies and start conducting counterattacks, what the Germans wanted was something what they called flexible defense. So they wanted a mobile defense. They did not want to be fixed in one point, because Hitler famously would not allow his generals to give up ground. You know, it was anathema to him. He felt his generals were defeatist, but of course they would say, well, why don't we withdraw to this line of hills or withdraw to this river for the winter and dig in? It gives us a natural barrier, and Hitler would never allow them to do that. And of course, as soon as you tie your troops to a certain area, they lose the initiative. The initiative passes over to the enemy.
Right.
And I say the Germans came up with what they called flexible defense. It was effectively mobile defense, all-round defense. It was a bit like, you know, something what the British Army conducted in North Africa. You had to be able to operate, you know, 360, because you never quite knew where the enemy was if they broke through.
Right.
The German army sort of did that in defiance of Hitler's demands, but increasingly as the war went on, he had these, you know, festons. He would brand everywhere a fortress and insist that it was held, because it would then be a breakwater that the Red Army would, you know, dissipate itself against. But of course that never worked, because increasingly the Germans didn't have the forces to conduct large-scale counteroffensives. And that became, particularly after Kursk in 1943, that really became the point then that Germany had lost the ability to conduct strategic level offensives. It could conduct tactical level counterattacks, but it didn't have the ability to launch a large death blow against the Red Army, you know, on the scale that it had in the first few years of the war.
Definitely. And I actually brought up tactics because I definitely think a lot of people like interested in military history kind of get a military strategist and a military tactician very different. So just briefly, Anthony, what are like the differences between the two?
Well, fundamentally, your tactics are what you use on a battlefield. So how you're going to win the battle, you know, it's sort of unit level. And your strategy really is big picture. So, you know, your strategy essentially is how you're going to win the war. And also in strategic terms, what is the battle's contribution to you winning the war? That's what its strategic value is. And I think that's where people tend to get confused, is that, I say, tactical level tends to be unit level, whereas strategy, it's, you know, indeed, well, the German strategy there was to nip off the bulge, you know,
right,
the bulge with a view to trapping the troops in it. tactically, their intention was to cut through very deep Soviet defenses using their armored divisions, which they achieved to a certain degree and then suffered great losses. But of course, the Soviet strategy there was to pinch off the German bulges either side the Kursk salient. So they kind of turned, it was on the Germans by nipping off the shoulders that the Germans had, flattened out the line. Because with the Eastern Front, it became, if you like, it became the Battle of the Bulges or the Battle of the Balconies. They called them balconies.
Right.
Because it's important to remember, of course, that the Eastern Front was never a straight line. You know, it wiggled up and down the Western Russia. And particularly come 1944, you had what they dubbed the Belarusian balcony, in that the German army was in a very large bulge in Belarusia, which the Germans wanted to flatten out, but again, Hitler wouldn't let them. And of course, with Operation Bagration in June 1944, the Red Army crushed that bulge, you know, and they annihilated Army Group Center. But ultimately, I'd say your tactics are what you use on the battlefield. The strategy is overall, you know, how are you going to win the battle? How are you going to win the war? So it's little picture, big picture is essentially the easy answer.
Okay. Thank you for that, Anthony. Thank you. And that actually kind of leads into, I'm going to use as a transition to now the Pacific Theater, because we've talked a good deal on the European theater. And when we look at the Pacific Theater during the Japanese, which were like the major dominant force in that, I always find it interesting looking at the Japanese military and how they advanced, especially when you research their history, that the military and the airmen and the Air Force were trained diligently and effectively pretty much picked out the colonial powers in Indochina, as well as in Korea, as well as in China. But then we get into a period which I find fascinating, is when they begin losing the war. The war starts to turn in their favor. The training and manpower really doesn't take hold, which I don't know if maybe we'll know this, but the Japanese military, the military that we've seen like in documentaries and film, that was from a select group of like so many troops, and they were trained like over like 2 decades of fighting force to be the dominant power in the region. So by the time they started losing manpower, they couldn't just retrain their soldiers. They couldn't automatically do that. So I guess to start off, Anthony, would you say comparatively the Imperial Japanese military and at least Nazi Germany's military were similar in the sense that they had this group, this military that had been trained for years, determined to achieve their goal in a certain time frame, but ultimately it was a battle of attrition? But when looking at the Japanese military, they were much more fanatical than the Nazi army, or I should say the German army.
You pick up on 2 good points there. I mean, the first thing to remember with Japan was, come the 1930s, they, like Nazi Germany, were looking for living space, empire, and resources, raw materials. And they essentially had 2 options, the strike north option or the strike south option. And they tried the strike north operation by attacking Mongolia and found themselves at war with the Soviet Union. Now, they lost. General Zhukov was there, and he defeated the Japanese army at a place called Khalkhin Gol in 1939, which was a pivotal battle because, of course, it meant it saved the Soviet Union from having to fight a 2-front war. And that operation, you know, because the Japanese lost, they signed a peace treaty with Moscow, and of course, crucially, it enabled Stalin to redeploy divisions in Siberia to Moscow, you know, in the winter of 41-42, to defend the capital. Now, obviously, if he'd been at war with Japan at the same time, he couldn't have done that. He would have fought a 2-front war, and like Germany would have been in a terrible position. So because they lost on the strike north option, they famously, of course, decided to strike south, which meant they attacked British and American colonial interests in the Far East and in the Pacific. And picking up the point about their army, yes, you're right. You know, whereas the Wehrmacht had sort of from 31 to 42 to hone its craft, you know, They became battle hardened, combat experienced, and highly competent and highly confident. The Japanese army had done the same thing in China. So throughout the 30s, they waged a war in China. They'd conquered much of Manchuria. Unlike the Germans, they conducted their own version of blitzkrieg. Their tanks weren't as good, but they'd learned, particularly after their mauling at the hands of Zhukov, they had learned the importance of combining tanks, artillery, infantry, and aircraft. So they were good at terror bombing, something like Shanghai.
Right.
So by 1941, the Japanese army was highly experienced and knew the business of waging war. I mean, they knew what to do. The only problem the Japanese had was that they typically, up to that point, had fought Chinese armies, which were largely infantry armies, predominantly infantry divisions, without much artillery, without many tanks or aircraft.
Right.
So the Japanese made up for their lack of numbers against very large Chinese armies using technology, because obviously their firepower was a force multiplier. When they came up against Britain, particularly in Burma, and then obviously America, with the island campaigns, increasingly, you're right, they lost a lot of those combat experienced troops, because obviously when they weren't fighting in Manchuria or on police duties in somewhere like Korea, they were sent to fight the British and Americans. And of course, as those troops were killed or wounded, they had to be replaced. And what happened was that the Japanese army increasingly relied on reluctant Korean recruits who did not want to fight for Imperial Japan, or they would use Manchu Kuo Chinese from Manchuria, because in the occupied territories, the Japanese, like the Germans did, co-opted local forces. So they had puppet armies. So in Manchuria, there were puppet Chinese armies. In Korea, had puppet Korean forces. And a lot of those were actually sent to the Pacific or to fight the Chinese in South Western China, or down into Burma to fight the British and Indian forces. So that, the Japanese were used to fighting over enormous areas. I mean, the 1930s Sino-Japanese wars, huge. I mean, it dwarfs the geography of Europe. But of course, they multiplied that by then tackling Burma and Malaya and Thailand, because they tacked that on.
Right.
Obviously, they then take the Philippines, which again is enormous archipelago of islands, huge area, and then all the other islands that they took. So the Japanese armed forces, Japanese Imperial Army and the Navy and the Air Force, ended stretched over this enormous space. And again, a bit like Germany opted for the strategy of dig in and hold fast, which is what forced America to fight the island hopping campaign.
Mm-hmm.
You and I can discuss whether that was the right thing to do. Cold light of day, you kind of think, actually, the US fleet could have simply cut those islands off and left the garrisons to starve. You didn't really need to do, Iwo Jima or Tarawa or Peleliu or any of those famous, amphibious assaults on those islands, because actually you could have starved the garrisons out and just besieged them. You didn't really need to, but obviously the thinking at the time was they needed to be cleared out. So that, the Japanese tactic of doing that, of holding on to those islands, overall strategically, of course, bought them time, because they knew the longer they held the islands, the more it delayed America being able to deploy bombers onto those islands to reach the main Japanese islands. Because for a while, America operated bombers from China, because they could reach Japan. With all those strategic bombing campaigns, the idea was to take the war to the heart of the enemy. And of course, the best way to do that was to fly them off Pacific Islands or from mainland China. So you can understand the Chinese strategy there of they created this large cordon sanitaire, if you like, in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, because once they did not win a rapid victory, they, like Nazi Germany, became locked in this war of attrition. Now, of course, their opening campaigns against Britain and America were remarkable. I mean, again, they did their own version of the Blitzkrieg. They took the Philippines pretty easily. They humiliated us in Malaya. They took Singapore, overran Thailand, much of Indochina. So their opening campaigns were phenomenal for the speed with which they did it. But of course, they then had to hold on to those territories. And because Britain and America didn't sue for peace with Japan, just simply went, it's now all part of the global war. Japan, like Germany, became locked in this war of attrition.
Right. And it is really interesting to note like the military strategy of Japan. In the sense, when you look at Southeast Asia, which I remember doing a paper on Southeast Asia, looking at Japan. And maybe you may not know this, but unlike in Korea, Manchuria, and northern China, where Japan was ultimately known for their atrocities against those countries, when you look at Southeast Asia, it's a really different story from the military, where they want to create the Southeast Asian Brotherhood and trying to help the locals kick out the colonial powers, especially in the case of French Indochina. And in my research, pretty much the Vietnamese in Indochina really wanted the French out. The French couldn't control or maintain the indigenous people there as they would in their other colonies, because Indochina was not the same. Living conditions were not the same. Geography was different. And when you look at Japan coming in, we're going to help you, but you're going to be a part of us. And then, of course, we see the fighting that comes about, where not only the locals are fighting, the French forces that are still there holding out, and of course, the Japanese. But then when you look at the locals, as the case in going down the road to Vietnam in the late 50s, early 60s, we see that the Vietnamese army modeled itself heavily after the Japanese army, which I didn't know that until that connection of how they fought, how they organized themselves, and of course later in life, the war of attrition era, where it's just like holding out. So in terms of like that concept, why do you think the Japanese military had like two different focus, where we're going to be this in the north, in northeastern China, but in Southeast Asia, we're going to have this mentality? Why was that? What was the ultimate military goal, the strategy-wise, for the Japanese army?
Well, the main thing tends to be persuading a population to cooperate. If you hold out the carrot of independence at some point, they're more likely to side with you. That was one of Hitler's great mistakes on the Eastern Front, was that he should have arrived in Ukraine and Belarus and said, we're here to liberate you from Soviet rule. Once the Red Army's defeated, you can have home rule.
Right.
Because in many of those areas, the Wehrmacht was actually welcomed with flowers and bread and salt and the usual stuff that the Russians do as well, because of course the Ukrainians had suffered badly during the Russian Civil War. Certainly Ukraine had declared itself independent, during the Russian Civil War, until the Red Army had turned up and incorporated it into the Soviet Union. So if Hitler actually had been more pro-independence for those regions, but of course he, like the Japanese with Tojo and Hirohito, they were really in the business of creating empires. That's what they wanted to do.
Right.
Also, of course, there's a racist ideology that comes into play. So, particularly with the Germans, they considered the Slavs as Untermenschen, subhuman. So they didn't consider Slavic people as on par with the Germanic people. And the Japanese indulged in a similar racist sort of approach in China and elsewhere. And you're right, with places like Burma and Vietnam and Thailand,
yes,
indeed the Indians, they fostered independence liberation armies. They held out that carrot that they might be independent one day. And what it meant was, of course, they ended up with lots of police forces that helped them keep control of the areas that they were occupying. When push came to shove, most of those sort of paramilitary organizations did not do much fighting against, British, Indian, or American troops, because they were used as police forces. Because famously with India, there was an Indian National Army,
right,
which, depending on your view, is they're patriots or they're traitors. But it was never very strong. I think it was a couple of divisions at the most. Didn't prove very effective. And of course, for the British administration in India, proved a bit of an embarrassment, because we weren't sure what to do with them. Because if you put them up against a wall and shot them, that would cause trouble in India. but they were viewed in terms of the Indian Army as traitors. Now, of course, in subsequent years, they're viewed as patriots. But so I think that you're right. The Japanese latched on to anti-colonial sentiment in Southeast Asia because they knew politically that would be a winner.
Right.
The colonial powers were going to have to close up shop and leave. And you're right, with Indochina, which of course subsequently became Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, huge area ruled by the French. You have to feel sorry for the Vichy French administration in Tonkin and Hanoi, because they didn't have the military resources to carry on controlling the area, nor could France help them. France is prostrate, it's divided in half. Northern France is occupied, as we just discussed, by Germany. So the French military in Indochina were pretty much out on a limb. So you can kind of understand why they acquiesced in letting the Japanese transit Indochina to attack Thailand, with a view, obviously, to then attacking Burma and Malaya and getting to Singapore, because they weren't really in a position to resist. Now, you could argue in an ideal world, and if it's a Hollywood movie, Arnold would have dictated that they would have sacrificed themselves putting up token resistance, but they didn't. To be fair to the French army, some units did take to the hills, but overall, the administration there acquiesced and let the Japanese in, because they didn't really have much difference. And then you're right. What also happened was, so you had these collaboration organizations working for the Japanese, but you also had anti-Japanese resistance organizations, which OSS, SOE helped equip. And of course, famously, the Viet Minh, which became Viet Cong ultimately, in Vietnam, were equipped with British and American weapons to fight the Japanese. But of course, you then make a rod for your own back, as we say, because you are creating guerrilla armies that at some point or other would become armies of national liberation, which for the Viet Minh is what they did. I think they've launched some half-hearted attacks against the Japanese. And by the same token, of course, Britain didn't do itself or the French any favors by, when we got into Indochina with the defeat of Japan, didn't really have the manpower to police those areas. So we used the Japanese military, which of course was not popular with the people that were there occupied. You go, well, you're a colonial power, they're a colonial power, and you're now collaborating even though you're at war. How does that work? So politically, it didn't set a very good example.
No, it didn't. And this is all incredibly fascinating, and it does fill in the context of World War II, because we think we know everything about World War II, but there's a lot of gray areas and hidden things that really need to fill in the cracks. And I think another one, what I think is equally important, is that World War II, as one of my friends said, who is a military historian, which is, it is the birthplace of, he would argue, of the, not special forces, but of the elite units or the famous units. You have, of course, the OSS, the SAS, and in the States you have regiments like the Navajo Code Talkers. You have the Arizona Bushmasters, who are the elite jungle operators of the Pacific. You have the Montfort Point Marines, who are in the Pacific. And all these units really came into focus during World War II, especially for the British. You also have the Gurkhas from Nepal. For the French, you have the French Foreign Legion. So all of these units really came about. And ultimately, why do you think it was World War II that really these units came about? Why was it specifically this war that these different units came about? Why is it? It's because of these units did not exist in World War I, and these would help ease the casualty rate of the Second World War, or what was their main objective, or that military thinking of creating these elite units?
The main driving power really ultimately was the ability to strike back at the enemy. So, for instance, in Britain, the formation of the commandos, which arose from, I think they were called independent companies that were sent to Norway, they were designed to be sort of standalone units that could operate on their own without a large logistical chain. So they'd sort of tested the concept in Norway. But the emergence of commandos really was about hitting back at occupied Nazi Germany and being a nuisance. Because obviously once the Germans were in northern France, it was closed off to us. So to try and make them not feel safe in their own backyard, if you like, Churchill was really keen on the idea of creating special forces that could hit back anywhere at any time at any place. Now, these days, courtesy of Hollywood, I think we have a rather rosy view of special forces. They're kind of seen as a bit of, yeah, not to disparage what they do. I mean, you know,
oh no,
Rangers, Delta Force, SEALs, you know, there's loads of them, highly trained individuals, very, very brave, very tough characters. But certainly in the early days, a lot of it was done by trial and error because they didn't really know what they were doing. You know, the fledgling SAS tended to be a bit of a disaster. They had more mishaps than successes. The early commando raids, likewise, were not terribly successful. But it was a case of trial and error. But also, he got Churchill's backing because he wanted, as I say, he wanted to strike back at the enemy. It's a bit like his support for RF Bomber Command. Again, it was pretty much the only way that Britain could strike back at Germany until such time as the second front was opened. So he was very supportive of Bomber Command. The other thing that influenced someone like Churchill, of course, was he'd served in South Africa during the Boer War. So he'd seen how Boer commandos operated, which indeed is where the name the British commandos came. It came from the Boers. He'd seen how they were irregular troops mounted on ponies, and small numbers of them could run circles around regular British Army units. So that was what he's after, these sort of self-sufficient units that show initiative, if you like, a force multipliers because they cause more trouble than their numbers should warrant, all that kind of stuff. So initially, sort of those special forces, they also then morphed into partisans because, of course, you then you've got resistance warfare in France with the resistance, but then in places like Yugoslavia, you've got the emergence of partisan forces, which became pretty much regular armies in the Yugoslav mountains. And all those units helped tie down large numbers of Axis security forces. You know, they made their lines of communication a misery, constantly attacking roads, railway lines, all that kind of stuff, airfields. So it really, if you like, special forces are kind of an element of total war that, you know, the gloves are off and you're going to use any and every method that you can to cause harm to the enemy because, you know, you're fighting to win, ergo you're going to use any method at your disposal. And again, with the special forces, they were very much in the early days very, very fledgling. I mean, I think by 1944 with D-Day, you know, particularly commandos then had honed themselves into highly competent units.
Right. So pretty much as like a summary, that these powers wanted this small group of soldiers that had the fighting capability of like a large group of men that were, as you said, self-sufficient. They can self-sustain themselves. They can get the job done. They can attack one direction, retreat another, and pretty much be a thorn in the side for their enemy, pretty much.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and again, you know, birth of airborne forces is the same thing. You know, it's the ability to drop eventually very large numbers of troops behind enemy lines and cause chaos. I mean, it's, again, that was very much, you know, trial and error. Famously, the airborne landings on Sicily were a complete disaster. They were dropped everywhere, missed their targets. But by D-Day, they're a great success. Arguably, apart from Arnhem, you could say, well, Market Garden was a great success. You know, Eindhoven, Nijmegen, they were all taken pretty easily. It was only the final bridge that proved to be the problem.
Right.
But again, with you know, the British airborne forces at Arnhem, they had ability to fight on their own for a while, for a limited amount of time, without being resupplied or supported in any great you know, in any great numbers. And that was all part of that special airborne, you know, special forces ethos. I mean, because even the airborne forces have that sort of, you know, that they consider themselves an elite. And I think no one's going to argue with that if you're prepared to throw yourself out of an airplane to go to war, you know, a certain level of courage. But again, you know, like the commandos and the US Rangers, airborne forces again were, you know, very fledgling at the start of the Second World War. I mean, Germans that had shown what was possible with things like, you know, the attack on Eben and Mao with the, you know, them dropping on the top of the fort and all that sort of thing, because the Germans had pretty much actually led the development of special forces, because they famously had something called the Brandenburg Regiment which was a special operations unit that would masquerade in enemy uniforms, infiltrate enemy lines. I mean,
Right.
unit got up to all sorts of hijinks, both on the Western Front and on the Eastern Front. And then, of course, by something like time of the Ardennes, you've got Otto Skorzeny in his 150 Brigade, masquerading as Americans, because I mean that essentially was a special operation designed to cause chaos behind American lines in the opening stages of the German Ardennes offensive. So the Germans were pretty good actually at special operations. I mean, they did that false flag operation in in the Danzig area, which sparked the war with Poland.
Right.
They got bodies from a mall, put them in Polish uniforms, claimed that the Poles had opened fire on them. So they were really good at that. On the Eastern Front, they famously conducted raids towards the Maykop oil fields down by Baku by dressing German, Russian speakers as Red Army soldiers. And they infiltrated enemy lines with a view to capturing oil fields before the Red Army could blow them up. I mean, again, it's stuff of sort of boys' own action and Hollywood type stories, but they did that, and I think it attracted probably a certain breed of individual that I would guess was an adrenaline junkie, if you like, that they got off on the excitement, because you'd have to, because you're in permanent danger. There's permanent risk of you being caught,
Right.
And particularly if you're in an enemy uniform, they're going to shoot you as a spy.
Yeah.
You say, well, this is a special operation, and actually we're regular troops. They go, well, you're masquerading as one of us, you're a spy, so you'll be shot. And that was the fate of some of Otto Skorzeny's guys in the Ardennes, is that they were, put on trial, tied to a post and shot as spies.
Dang, that is graphic. And for our last question of this wonderful, very, very informative session, do you think there's a lot of things, even now in the 21st century, where we've had years of other conflicts, other wars, that there are still some things we can learn from World War II regarding military tactics and strategies? And as like a follow-up to that, why do you think that World War II military strategies are some of the most fun to discuss and explore?
I think in terms of lessons learned, the nature of warfare doesn't change really. The technology does, but it's all about taking and holding ground. Afghanistan was an example of that. Is that to keep the enemy out, you've got to hold the ground.
Right.
So that becomes a fundamental truth. We've seen that in the Ukraine with the Ukraine-Russian war, that both sides are fighting over ground. Russia's annexed certain areas, the Ukrainians want it back. So it's that ability to hold and take ground. I think the other key thing always is that wherever you're fighting, if you don't take the local population along with you, then you're never going to win. And again, Afghanistan was a fine example of that. When they launched Operation Enduring Freedom for Afghanistan, you kind of thought British and US policymakers have not been advised by historians, because they will say you will not be welcomed by the Afghans. Typically for any country, if there's one thing that's going to galvanize and unite a population, it's a foreign invader. I mean, every time it happens, Soviet Union did that.
Mm-hmm.
If an outside party attacks a country, it usually unites everyone despite their differences. And with Afghanistan, slightly different. Of course, we tend to view wars in modern states that are unitary states, in that they function
Right.
the government. But of course, sadly, the world still has a lot of failed states like Somalia and Yemen and Afghanistan. And with Afghanistan, it never functioned as a unitary state. So for the coalition to think that it could turn up in Kabul, install democracy in a Western-style military, and that would work, it didn't. And I think the failing with Afghanistan was, of course, is that we tried to create a Western-style military with the Afghan National Army, and that didn't work. And of course, that we saw that in Vietnam with the South Vietnamese Army, in that America tried to replicate an American army in South Vietnam, but of course, culturally and military, it wasn't the same thing. And
Right.
also with Afghanistan and something like Vietnam, once you take away American logistical muscle, the resupply, the ammunition, your helicopters, air.
Right.
Once you take back all the support elements, you take that off an army that was relying on you to do that all the time, it collapses. That's what happens every time. Sorry, remind me, what was the second half of the question?
I think the second question is why even now the strategies of World War II are so fascinating to learn. What is it about the Second World War in terms of military studies, military history that captivates everybody? What is it about that war that truly sets it apart from other wars of the 20th century?
Well, I think it's encapsulated by the conversation we've just had in terms of course, it was the strategic challenge that everyone faced in fighting a global war. Because apart from Latin America, it affected North America, it affected Europe, North Africa, the Pacific, Southeast Asia. So it affected a huge chunk of the globe, and on the whole was highly mobile. And I think that's what tends to fascinate people. It was because you think someone like Roosevelt or Churchill or indeed Stalin, you imagine the enormous strain that they were under you've got to run the country as a politician. So you've still got your education, transport, healthcare, all the normal stuff that a state does. You've still got to keep an eye on that while worrying about, when's the second front going to open? When are the landing craft ready? When are the Liberty ships coming out? The factories churning out enough equipment for us and for our allies. Because famously America became the arsenal of democracy. The number of arms that it supplied over and above its aim was just extraordinary. America's industrial muscle that enabled it to crank out all that stuff. So I think it's that sort of, it's the global nature of the Second World War that people find really fascinating. It's also the challenges of trying to problem solve. And I think the thing that probably fascinates you and I as historians is we have the benefit of hindsight, but that can be a dangerous tool because at the time they didn't have that.
Right.
So essentially they were making it up as they went along.
Right.
And a prime example of that is, as we discussed earlier, is the invasion of Sicily. Well, Stalin wanted an attack on northern France.
Right.
He didn't really have the resources to do it. Also, Churchill and Roosevelt had agreed that they would go for a Mediterranean first strategy, that they would clear the Germans and Italians out of North Africa. And then also, of course, Churchill then prevailed, going, well, if we attack Sicily and strike Italy, that will knock the Italians out of the war. We can then do the soft underbelly of Europe, strike up into Austria towards Berlin, and the war's over. So now we take that narrative for granted, but actually at the time they were making it up. And you've got Paul Roosevelt saying to Churchill, but we've promised Stalin that we will.
Yeah, and being the mediator between the two.
Yeah, because going on a bit here, but it's like with the invasions in the south of France. Operation Dragoon took place because Roosevelt and Churchill had promised Stalin that there would be a two-pronged attack on France. Now, we just take D-Day for granted as the opening of the Second Front, but actually it was two-part. There's the landing of the French Riviera as well. And Churchill did not want that to take place. He saw D-Day as a distraction from the fighting in Italy, and then to shave off yet more divisions to take part in the invasion of the south of France. He didn't want that to happen, but both he and Roosevelt had promised Stalin that they were going to do it. So Eisenhower's hands were tied, because famously with Dragoon, it didn't take place until mid-August 1944, by which time the Germans were already trapped in Normandy. So, and all the better units that might have been tied down in the south of France by an invasion had already moved north to take part in fighting in Normandy. So that invasion in the south of France was completely nugatory, really. But it was that dilemma of the Allies had agreed that that was their strategy and that was what they could do, and they stuck with it.
It is true, and ultimately culminating in this discussion is that all these strategies that we've been talking about, everybody, it was like, as Anthony said, they were just experimenting on this. They didn't know it was going to work or not. They were just hoping it did, and they did. By luck, they did. And now when we research this, we really don't consider that thing, oh, well, they knew this was going to happen. So it's like, not really. They were just hoping it would work, and it worked in the right place, right time, right situation. And that's how the Second World War, in terms of the strategies, sort of came about. And this will here mark the stop for this wonderful discussion between me and Anthony. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast for the show. Now, where can people find and engage with you? And do you have any upcoming projects that you would like to announce?
Yeah, I've got a fairly rudimentary website. I mean, I have to confess, I don't, like many people, I don't update it very often. I'm a limited social media user, so you'll find me on Facebook and LinkedIn. Funny enough, actually, mentioning Churchill, well, my current project, which is due to the publishers shortly, is I'm doing a book on Churchill for next year, because, of course, it's the 150th anniversary of his birth.
Wow.
And I did a book a couple of years ago looking at his military career. So from him, graduating as a cadet lieutenant from Sandhurst up to the end of the Second World War. And this book's a sequel, if you like. It then follows his second premiership during the Cold War. So it looks at the emergence of the Iron Curtain, the Berlin blockade. It also looks at, of course, how he dealt with end of empire. Because, of course, the 1950s, but obviously late 40s, independence. Once India went, the issue of the British Empire became largely redundant, because everyone wanted independence. So I've looked. I say the book's about how he coped with facing communism, and also how he coped with dismantling the British Empire. I mean, it became the Commonwealth pretty much, but
right.
His second premiership is not really very well known. Lots of people don't actually realise that he was prime minister twice. But of course, first time he was an emergency prime minister. He didn't win an election because obviously Chamberlain resigned and he replaced Chamberlain. And in 1945, famously, of course, Labour won the election and Clement Attlee became prime minister for a 5-year period. Won another election but didn't have a sufficient majority. And the Conservatives then got in with obviously Churchill as head. So he did almost another 5 years. I mean, he sadly he was suffering from ill health by that point, because he was an old man.
Right.
But he'd served twice as prime minister, and lots of people don't realise that. And also, I was interested in lots of the things in recent years that he's taken flack and criticism for. So it's his dealings with things like Palestine and his views on India, how he dealt with the communist insurgency in Malaya, Mau Mau rising in Kenya.
Right.
Covers all that. So that's what's been essentially keeping me quiet. And then for next year, I've got a book lined up, going back to my roots, if you like. That's the war. I'm doing a book on the campaigns for the Rhineland in late 44, 45. But as you know, I think I did a book on Market Garden and the Battle of the German point of view. So I'm doing defense of the Rhineland from the German point of view. What the German army was down on its knees by then, pretty much. So what possessed them to carry on resisting? Because there wasn't
right.
So it's sort of looking at all those battles that took place at the end of the year and early part of 45, and sort of hopefully we'll try and shed some light on German mentality, on why they didn't surrender en masse, because they should have done, quite frankly.
Nice.
So that'll be keeping me quiet. And of course we've got next year is the 80th anniversary of D-Day.
Right, definitely.
Only seems 5 minutes ago. It was the 75th anniversary. I don't know where the time goes.
Hey, with history, we kind of get lost in the facts and the dates, but I will link all that down below. If you want to see Anthony's previous works, you can find them on LinkedIn. I'll link that profile down below. Definitely check them out. You will not be disappointed. If you're looking for a good historical read, or if you are a college student looking for a World War II reference book, or a historian looking for a new read, definitely check out Anthony. He has a wide range of books to explore. And speaking of books, as many of you may know, I've been working on a sequel to my debut novel, The Gathering, and I'm proud to announce that the sequel, Amanus, Son of Persia, is officially out on ebook for purchase. Now, the print books will be available later this week. But as I said earlier, the ebook of Amethyst Son of Persia is out for purchase. It is an amazing read. I would recommend reading the first book, The Gathering, because there are plot elements in the sequel. I will link that down below to check it out. And again, thank you to my guest, Anthony, for joining us today, for providing his insight and his wisdom. And thank you all for enjoying this series. Thank you all very much. It means a lot to me. And this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Have a good day, everybody.